She consulted for the most powerful real estate empire in the country, but remained completely unaware her poor husband was actually the trillionaire who owned it, and on his birthday, she left him to marry his arrogant boss, triggering a calculated revenge that would cut off her family's wealth and leave her lover drowning in debt. The woman who'd shared his bed for 3 years had looked at his worn jacket and empty wallet with disgust, but never once glanced beneath the surface to see the empire he'd built in shadows. Her family had mocked him at every holiday dinner. Her mother had called him worthless to his face, but the man serving them coffee had satellite phones hidden in his car, linked directly to Wall Street's most powerful players. The boss she ran to, the one with the corner office and Italian suits, had spent years taking credit for deals he never closed, but the credit cards he flashed so proudly were maxed out on a lifestyle propped up entirely by lies. Now the truth was surfacing like a submarine breaking through dark water, but the devastation it would bring would sink everyone who'd underestimated the quiet man they'd dismissed. What drove a trillionaire to hide his empire from his own wife? What moment on that birthday finally shattered his willingness to endure her contempt? How completely would a woman's world collapse when she discovered the poor husband she abandoned owned everything she'd worked to build? And what depths of financial ruin awaited the arrogant boss who'd stolen another man's wife without realizing he'd just made an enemy who controlled his every asset? The story. The rain hammered against the windows of Sterling and Associates real estate consultancy with the kind of relentless intensity that matched Rebecca Morrison's ambition. But inside the glass tower, she barely noticed the storm as she stood before the presentation screen, outlining acquisition strategies for properties worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. She'd clawed her way from a state school education to this mahogany-paneled conference room, but the designer clothes she wore and the confidence in her voice couldn't completely mask the desperation that drove her, the bone-deep need to prove she was more than the girl who'd married down. Her husband would be waiting at home with whatever pathetic grocery store cake he'd managed to afford on his substitute teacher's salary, but Rebecca had already made her choice about how this birthday evening would end. The fluorescent lights caught the gleam of her engagement ring, not the one Daniel had given her with trembling hands and mumbled apologies about its modest size, but the massive diamond that sat in her desk drawer, given to her 3 weeks ago by Connor Hayes during a business trip to Miami that had crossed every professional line. Connor Hayes stood at the head of the conference table now, his 6'2" frame filling out a suit that cost more than Daniel made in 6 months. But what captivated Rebecca wasn't just his appearance, it was the power he wielded as managing director of Sterling and Associates' Western Division. He'd joined the company the same week she had 3 years ago, but his trajectory had been meteoric while she'd remained stuck at senior consultant, and she'd convinced herself that attaching her future to his rising star was strategic thinking rather than betrayal. "Excellent analysis, Rebecca," Connor said, his voice carrying that smooth authority that made junior associates straighten their spines, but his eyes held a different message, the intimate knowledge of what she looked like when that professional armor came off. "Your research on the Thornfield Properties portfolio is exactly the ammunition we need for tomorrow's acquisition meeting." She felt the familiar thrill of his approval warming her chest, but that warmth curdled slightly when she thought about Daniel waiting at home with his hopeful smile and bargain bin wine. Her husband had supported her through late nights and weekend work with the patience of a saint, but that patience had begun to feel like complacency, and complacency looked too much like the poverty she'd spent her whole adult life trying to escape. The conference room emptied as associates gathered their tablets and leather portfolios, but Connor's hand brushed against her lower back as she reached for her briefcase, a touch that would have seemed accidental to anyone watching, but carried 3 weeks of secret weight. "We should discuss the Malaysia deal over dinner," he said quietly, though they both knew the Malaysia deal was just a flimsy excuse for what would actually happen in the restaurant's private dining room. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Traffic was terrible, but I got the good ice cream from that place you like. Can't wait to celebrate with you. Love you." The message should have sparked guilt, but instead, it ignited irritation that surprised her with its intensity. Daniel's sweetness had once seemed endearing, but now it read as weakness, the contentment of a man who'd never hunger for more than his small classroom and smaller paycheck. He'd been so proud when she'd landed this job, but he'd never understood that working with empires made you crave one of your own. And Connor Hayes looked like an empire, while Daniel looked like a garage sale. "I'll meet you at 8, she told Connor, her decision crystallizing with a finality that felt like stepping off a cliff. "But there's something I need to do first." The drive home through rain-slicked streets gave her time to rehearse the speech she'd been composing for weeks, but no amount of rehearsal could quite dull the edge of what she was about to do. The modest apartment complex where she and Daniel lived looked even more depressing in the downpour, but she'd stopped seeing it as a temporary stepping stone and started seeing it as a prison. Evidence of Daniel's complete lack of ambition and financial sense. She found him in their cramped kitchen, flour dusting his worn sweater as he piped frosting onto a homemade cake with the kind of concentration he brought to everything. But the sight that should have softened her heart instead hardened her resolve. This was the man she'd married in a courthouse ceremony because they couldn't afford a real wedding, but 3 years later he was still grading papers at a scratched dining table while she moved in circles where people discussed property portfolios worth hundreds of millions. "You're home!" Daniel's face lit up with uncomplicated joy as he set down the piping bag, but the happiness dimmed when he registered her expression. "Everything okay? You look—" "We need to talk," Rebecca said, setting her designer briefcase on the counter with a decisive thud that made their discount dishes rattle. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel. I can't keep pretending this is enough." The color drained from his face in a way that might have broken her 3 years ago, but she'd hardened herself for this moment by cataloging every inadequacy until his poverty felt like a personal insult. His worn clothes, their second-hand furniture, the way he'd apologized when he couldn't afford the anniversary dinner she'd wanted. It had all built into a resentment that overwhelmed whatever affection remained. "What are you talking about?" Daniel's voice came out thin and confused, but there was something else underneath. Something that sounded almost like resignation, as if he'd been waiting for this conversation. "If this is about money again, I told you I'm working on getting a permanent position." "It's not just about money," Rebecca interrupted, though they both knew that was a lie. "It's about ambition, drive. You're content to grade middle school essays for the rest of your life while I'm building something real. I need a partner who matches my energy, and Connor—" She stopped, but the damage was already visible in Daniel's eyes. "Connor Hayes," Daniel said slowly, and something shifted in his expression, not heartbreak, but something harder to read. "Your boss, the managing director. He's offered me opportunities you never could," Rebecca said, her prepared speech dissolving into cruel honesty. "A partnership track, equity in the deals I bring in, and yes, he's asked me to marry him, someone who actually has ambitions that extend beyond a classroom." Daniel stood very still, his flour-dusted hands resting on the counter as if he needed its support. But his eyes had gone distant in a way Rebecca had never seen before. "Today's my birthday," he said quietly, and the simple statement carried more weight than any accusation could have. "I know." Rebecca pulled the massive engagement ring from her purse and slipped it onto her finger, watching the diamonds catch the kitchen's cheap overhead light. "And I know the timing is terrible, but staying when I've already moved on emotionally would be worse. I'll have my things moved out by the end of the week." She expected him to argue or beg or rage, But Daniel just nodded slowly, his expression settling into something that looked almost like anticipation. "Before you go," he said, reaching for his phone with hands that no longer trembled, "there's something you should know about Connor Hayes and the company you've devoted the last 3 years to building." Rebecca's irritation flared because she didn't want her dramatic exit undercut by whatever petty information Daniel thought he had, but something in his tone made her pause. "What are you talking about?" "Sterling and Associates isn't what you think it is," Daniel said, scrolling through his phone with sudden purpose. "The parent company that owns it, Apex Holdings, I've been watching Connor Hayes's financial statements very carefully for the past 6 months, ever since you started coming home smelling like his cologne." The casual mention of his knowledge hit her like cold water, but before she could formulate a response, Daniel turned his phone screen toward her. The email displayed showed a corporate organizational chart, but Rebecca's eyes caught on one detail that made her stomach drop. "Apex Holdings is wholly owned by a single entity," Daniel continued, his voice taking on an edge she'd never heard before. "Richmond Capital Trust. And Richmond Capital Trust is the holding company for approximately $47 billion in global real estate assets, including every property Sterling and Associates has ever consulted on." "What does this have to do with anything?" Rebecca demanded, but her voice had lost its certainty because the numbers on Daniel's screen were too specific, too detailed for casual research. "Richmond Capital Trust is owned by one person," Daniel said, setting his phone down on the counter next to his homemade birthday cake. "Me. My full legal name is Daniel Richmond Morrison, and I've owned Sterling and Associates, along with 347 other real estate ventures across 6 continents, since before I met you in that coffee shop 3 years ago." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, but Rebecca's mind couldn't quite process them because they contradicted everything she knew about reality. Daniel lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and wore thrift store sweaters and drove a 15-year-old sedan that smelled like old textbooks, but the man standing in front of her was claiming to own an empire that would make him one of the wealthiest people on earth. "That's insane," she said, but her voice wavered because Daniel's expression held none of the uncertainty she'd grown accustomed to dismissing. "You're a substitute teacher. We can barely afford this apartment." "I'm a substitute teacher because I find teaching middle school literature genuinely fulfilling," Daniel corrected, pulling up another screen on his phone, this one showing what appeared to be a real-time portfolio management dashboard with numbers that made Rebecca's vision blur. "And we live in this apartment because you chose it when we got married, and I saw no reason to argue. Every dollar I couldn't afford to spend on fancy dinners or designer clothes has been a choice, not a limitation." He swiped to another screen showing a social media post from Connor Hayes taken 2 days ago. Her future fiancé standing in front of what he'd claimed was his new Maserati. But Daniel's records showed the car was actually a lease he was 3 months behind on, collateralized against credit cards that were maxed out at 17 different banks. "Your new husband is $47 million in debt," Daniel continued, his tone almost conversational despite the nuclear bomb he was detonating. "The penthouse he took you to in Miami belongs to a friend who lets him use it for appearances. The business deals he discusses so impressively. He's a facilitator at best, and most of the actual negotiations are handled by people he'll never meet. His entire lifestyle is leveraged against a salary and bonus structure that depends entirely on Sterling and Associates' quarterly performance." Rebecca's legs felt unstable, but she forced herself to remain standing because sitting would feel like surrender. "Why would you hide this, if you're actually who you're claiming to be?" "I wanted to be loved for who I am, not what I own," Daniel said, and for the first time something that looked like genuine hurt crossed his face. My first engagement ended when my fiancé discovered my net worth and started planning how to spend it before we'd even finished the wedding invitations. So when I met you, smart, driven, beautiful, I decided to see if someone could love the man without the empire. Apparently, the answer is no. The cruelty of his social experiment hit Rebecca like a physical blow, but she couldn't deny that he'd given her every opportunity to choose him without financial incentive. Every anniversary where he'd offered handwritten letters instead of jewelry, every time he'd suggested a home-cooked meal instead of expensive restaurants. He'd been testing her, and she'd failed each time by making her disappointment obvious. "You're telling me," Rebecca said slowly, her career-oriented mind starting to process implications that made her nauseated, "that every deal I've worked on, every property portfolio I've analyzed for Sterling and Associates you already owned or had controlling interest in," Daniel confirmed, pulling up a specific file that made Rebecca's blood run cold. "Including the Thornfield Properties portfolio you just spent 3 hours analyzing for tomorrow's acquisition meeting. The one Connor told you was his make-or-break deal for making executive director." Rebecca's brilliant analytical mind, the same one that had earned her promotions and Connor's interest, finally started connecting dots that formed a picture more devastating than any divorce could be. "If you already own those properties, then there's no acquisition to be made," Daniel finished. "Connor's entire presentation tomorrow is based on buying assets from a seller who doesn't exist, using leverage he doesn't have, to close a deal that was always going to fail. He's been setting himself up as the architect of Sterling and Associates' next big expansion, but in reality, he's been pitching my own properties back to me through intermediaries who've been documenting every fraudulent claim and financial misrepresentation." The implications crashed over Rebecca like a series of increasingly devastating waves. "You've been building a case against him." "I've been building a case against anyone who preys on the people who work for me," Daniel corrected, his substitute teacher patience replaced by something far colder. "Connor Hayes has been sexually harassing 3 junior associates, falsifying expense reports, and stealing credit for deals closed by analysts he later fired to eliminate witnesses. You weren't his first affair with a married employee, just the one that happened to involve my wife." Rebecca's designer engagement ring suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but she couldn't look away from Daniel's phone as he pulled up file after file of evidence. Bank statements showing Connor's mounting debts, HR complaints that had been mysteriously buried, email chains where Connor discussed manipulating vulnerable employees into relationships that compromised their professional judgment. "Tomorrow's acquisition meeting isn't happening," Daniel said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who actually owned the boardroom where she'd been performing. "Sterling and Associates Board, which I control through Richmond Capital Trust, is meeting at 7 a.m. to terminate Connor Hayes for cause. His severance package is void due to the fraud documentation and the personal guarantees he signed on those 17 maxed-out credit cards come due immediately upon employment termination." "You're destroying him," Rebecca whispered, but it wasn't quite an accusation because her analytical mind recognized justice when she saw it, even when it collided with her own interests. "I'm holding him accountable," Daniel corrected. "The destruction is entirely his own creation. I'm just removing the supports he built from lies and stolen opportunities. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, Connor Hayes will be unemployed, immediately liable for $47 million in personal debt, and facing potential criminal charges for the expense report fraud alone." Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from Connor. "Running late for dinner. Order the expensive wine. We're celebrating your new partnership track tonight." The irony was so sharp it drew blood. She'd left her husband on his birthday to celebrate a promotion that would never materialize with a man who was about to lose everything. But the full scope of her miscalculation was still revealing itself in layers. Your family, Daniel continued, pulling up another file that made Rebecca's knees actually buckle this time. Your mother Patricia and father Robert Morrison, your brother Kyle, they've been so generous with their opinions about my inadequacy at every holiday dinner and family gathering. Don't, Rebecca said, because she could see where this was going and the landscape beyond was scorched earth. They never knew about your situation. They just saw what I showed them. What you showed them was a substitute teacher who couldn't provide proper gifts or pay for nice restaurants, Daniel agreed. What they decided was that I was a dead weight preventing you from success. Your mother called me a financial drain at Christmas dinner. Your father suggested you deserved better every time I saw him. Your brother Kyle has been introducing you to his wealthy colleagues at every opportunity, hoping you'd trade up. He pulled up a property record that showed her parents' house, the one they'd owned for 30 years, and finally paid off 5 years ago with a refinance they'd celebrated with champagne. The bank that provided their refinance? Subsidiary of one of my holdings. The mortgage terms were extremely favorable because the loan officer recognized your last name from my personal file and flagged it for VIP treatment. Oh God, Rebecca breathed, watching the dominoes Daniel was preparing to topple. Your brother Kyle's construction company, Daniel continued relentlessly. 73% of his revenue over the past 2 years has come from subcontracting work on properties I own. His largest client, the one he thinks he landed through his own marketing genius. That's a shell company operated by my property management division, created specifically to ensure your family had financial stability. The phone buzzed again. Connor, the partnership track comes with a signing bonus BTW, thinking we should look at houses in Clearwater Hills this weekend. Clearwater Hills, where homes started at $3 million. But Connor Hayes was about to be homeless and $47 million in debt. Rebecca had traded a trillionaire husband for a con artist drowning in leverage he couldn't service. What are you going to do? Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer from the systematic way Daniel had presented each piece. Your parents' mortgage is being called in due to technical violations in the original documentation, Daniel said, and his voice held no satisfaction, just the flat delivery of inevitable consequences. Violations that were always present but overlooked as a courtesy. They have 60 days to repay the full balance or face foreclosure. They're retired, Rebecca protested weakly. They can't possibly. Your brother Kyle's primary client will be discontinuing all contracts due to corporate restructuring, Daniel continued. The accounts receivable he's been counting on to meet this quarter's payroll delayed indefinitely pending review of work quality standards that were never adequately defined in the original contracts. Rebecca's strategic mind understood exactly what Daniel was doing. Her parents couldn't repay their mortgage without selling the house they'd lived in for 3 decades. But the real estate market he controlled would mysteriously offer only lowball prices for their property. Kyle's construction company would bleed cash trying to cover payroll on work he'd already performed but wouldn't be paid for, forcing him into bankruptcy or desperate loans at predatory rates. You're cutting off my entire family's wealth, Rebecca said, the full title of her tragedy finally revealing itself, and leaving Connor in debt that will follow him for decades. I'm removing the artificial supports I provided because I loved you, Daniel corrected quietly. Your family's wealth was always subsidized by my intervention. Connor's lifestyle was always unsustainable leverage. I'm not creating these disasters. I'm just stopping my protection from preventing the natural consequences of their choices and his fraud. The homemade birthday cake sat between them on the counter, its frosting spelling out "Happy Birthday, Daniel" in careful letters that Rebecca could now see had taken genuine time and effort. She'd been planning to leave before eating even a bite, but now that cake represented everything she'd failed to value. the quiet devotion of someone who'd loved her without needing an audience, without needing validation, without needing her to be anything other than who she was. "I spent 3 years trying to prove I was worthy of you," Rebecca said, her voice breaking on the bitter irony. "Working late nights, building my career, making connections, and the whole time I was performing for someone who already owned the stage." "You spent 3 years proving who you actually are," Daniel said, and this correction carried the weight of genuine disappointment. "Someone who values wealth over character, status over integrity, appearances over substance. I didn't hide my empire to trick you. I hid it to see if you could love me without it. Every test you failed was one you set for yourself." Rebecca's phone exploded with a series of increasingly frantic texts from Connor. "Something's wrong. Board called emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're asking about expense reports from 2023. Do you have copies? Call me now. This is serious. They know about Miami. Someone told them. Was it you?" The desperation in his messages made something click in Rebecca's understanding. "You could have exposed him at any time," she said to Daniel, "but you waited until I left you for him. You wanted me to make this choice." "I wanted to give you every opportunity to make a different choice," Daniel countered. "Every late night I brought you tea while you worked. Every time I suggested we spend an evening just talking instead of you networking at another industry function. Every birthday, anniversary, and random Tuesday when I tried to show you that love isn't measured in property portfolios and designer labels." He pulled up one final document, their marriage certificate, signed 3 years ago in a courthouse because they'd agreed an expensive wedding was wasteful. "You asked me once why I chose teaching when I could do anything. Remember what I told you?" Rebecca did remember, though she'd dismissed it at the time as rationalization from someone without options. "You said teaching lets you make a difference in individual lives without the corruption that comes with power." "I meant it," Daniel said. "I've built a $47 billion empire, but the most meaningful part of my day is usually explaining To Kill a Mockingbird to 8th graders who think they'll never need literature. Money amplifies who you already are. It doesn't transform you into someone better. You wanted me to be ambitious, but you never asked what I was ambitious for." The rain had stopped, but the silence in their small kitchen felt louder than the storm. Rebecca looked at the engagement ring Connor had given her, the one that was probably purchased on one of those 17 maxed-out credit cards that were about to come due. She looked at the homemade cake Daniel had prepared with hands that could have bought any bakery in the city. She looked at the man she'd dismissed as poor and powerless, who'd apparently spent 3 years testing whether she could see beyond the surface he'd deliberately constructed. "What happens now?" she asked, though the question felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd destroyed. "You'll move out as you planned," Daniel said, his tone suggesting the logistics had already been determined. "Connor will be unemployed and drowning in debt by noon tomorrow. Your family will discover that financial stability without foundation is just an expensive illusion. And I'll continue teaching 8th grade literature because that's what actually brings me satisfaction." "You're really going to foreclose on my parents' house?" Rebecca asked, desperate for some sign that his mercy might extend beyond what she deserved. "I'm going to call in a mortgage that was always conditional on courtesy. I no longer have reason to extend," Daniel corrected. "If they can repay it, the house stays theirs. If Kyle's construction company can survive without artificially inflated contracts, he'll stay afloat. If Connor's lifestyle was actually supported by legitimate income, he'll recover. I'm just removing my thumb from the scale." Rebecca's phone rang, Connor calling now, his panic presumably escalating. She let it go to voicemail because there was nothing she could say that would change what was coming, but the sound of his ringtone was a reminder of just how completely she'd miscalculated human value. "I loved you," Daniel said quietly, and the past tense was a door closing. "Not because you were brilliant at property analysis or beautiful or ambitious. I loved you because there were moments, rare ones admittedly, when you'd forget to perform and just be present, when you'd laugh at my terrible teacher jokes or get excited about a student's progress or suggest we spend Sunday morning reading instead of networking. Those moments suggested there was someone genuine underneath the ambition. There was, Rebecca protested, but even she could hear how weak that sounded. Maybe, Daniel acknowledged, but she got buried under someone who measured worth in bank balances and corner offices. You met a man who owned nothing you could see and decided he was worthless. You met a man who owned everything and decided he was everything. Neither assessment involved who we actually were as people. He picked up the piping bag and added a final detail to the birthday cake, a small flourish that completed whatever design he'd been creating. I'm going to eat this cake and watch the terrible action movie I rented, he said. You should probably go meet Connor for dinner while he can still afford to pay for expensive wine. Tomorrow's going to be difficult for both of you. The dismissal was gentle, but absolute. Rebecca gathered her briefcase and the engagement ring that suddenly felt like evidence of fraud, but paused at the door of the apartment she'd been so eager to leave. For what it's worth, she said, I am sorry about the timing, about everything. I'm not, Daniel said, cutting himself a slice of birthday cake. Better to know now than 10 years from now, when the revelation would hurt more. You showed me exactly who you are, Rebecca. I just wish you'd been curious enough to wonder who I was beneath what you assumed. Rebecca drove to the restaurant where Connor waited in a private dining room he couldn't afford, her mind racing through implications that grew more devastating with each mile. The man she'd dismissed as poor had proven himself richer than she could have imagined, but more importantly, he'd proven himself capable of a restraint and strategic patience that made Connor's flash and bravado look like amateur theater. Connor sat at a table set for celebration, his Italian suit perfectly pressed and his confident smile firmly in place. But Rebecca could now see the desperation underneath. The way his eyes darted when the sommelier mentioned a $2,000 bottle, the slight hesitation before he handed over a credit card that was probably micrograms away from being declined. You look like you've seen a ghost, Connor said, pouring wine that Rebecca suddenly couldn't stomach. Everything okay with the substitute teacher? He take the news hard? He knows everything, Rebecca said, watching Connor's performance crack slightly. About Miami, about the Thornfield deal, about your debts. The color drained from Connor's face in a way that would have been satisfying if Rebecca wasn't drowning in her own disaster. That's impossible. He's a nobody. How would a substitute teacher possibly— He's not a substitute teacher, Rebecca interrupted, pulling up the Richmond Capital Trust website on her phone and watching Connor's expression crumble as he processed the organizational charts and asset listings. Or rather he is, but that's his hobby. His actual occupation is owning approximately $47 billion in global real estate holdings, including Sterling and Associates, including every property you've ever claimed to have deals on, including presumably this restaurant where you're trying to impress me with money you don't have. Connor's phone started ringing before she finished speaking, a number he clearly recognized as important because the blood drained completely from his face. The board, he whispered. They moved the meeting to tonight. Emergency session. They know. They know because he told them, Rebecca said, feeling oddly distant from her own catastrophe. He's known for months, maybe longer. He's been building documentation while I analyzed his own properties and you stole credit for deals he controlled. We're not dining with a future executive director. We're eating a last meal with an unemployed fraud who's about to be $47 million in debt. The engagement ring on her finger caught the candlelight, and Connor's eyes fixed on it with something approaching horror. I bought that on credit you can't pay back, Rebecca finished, along with the lease on the car you claimed to own, the penthouse you pretended was yours, and the lifestyle that was always about 20 seconds from complete collapse. My husband, my poor, boring substitute teacher husband, just pulled every support beam out from under both of us. And we're about to discover what free fall actually feels like. Connor's phone kept ringing, but he'd stopped answering because there were no right words for what was coming. The board meeting would end his employment, the immediate debt would destroy his credit, and the fraud investigation would eliminate any chance of recovery in the real estate industry. He'd built a house of cards on someone else's empire, never realizing the emperor was watching every move. "Your family," Connor said desperately, grasping at the connection that had seemed like Rebecca's primary asset. "Your brother's construction company, your parents' house. Surely they can help until we figure something out." "He's foreclosing on my parents' mortgage," Rebecca said flatly, "and cutting off Kyle's primary revenue stream. The wealth I brought to this relationship was always subsidized by the man I left. We're not combining resources, Connor. We're pooling disasters." The sommelier returned to suggest an after-dinner cognac, but Connor waved him away with hands that visibly trembled. The private dining room that had seemed so elegant now felt like a cage, and the man across from Rebecca looked less like an ambitious executive and more like a drowning person who'd just realized the life preserver was actually an anchor. "What do we do?" Connor asked, and the question revealed just how thoroughly he'd been performing confidence without actual competence. "You face bankruptcy, fraud charges, and career annihilation," Rebecca said, surprised by her own coldness. "I face a divorce from a man I never actually knew, the collapse of my family's financial security, and the knowledge that I traded authentic love for leverage. I completely misunderstood. We don't do anything together, Connor. We were never actually together. I was just another deal you thought you'd closed without reading the fine print." She stood, leaving the engagement ring on the table next to wine neither of them would drink. "Good luck at your board meeting, though I suppose luck isn't really the issue when the board is owned by the man whose wife you stole on his birthday." The drive back to the apartment she'd planned to leave forever took Rebecca through streets that looked different now that she understood the architecture of power she'd been navigating. Daniel owned so much of this city that nearly every building she passed was ultimately his property, but he'd never mentioned it because ownership wasn't his identity, the way it had become Connor's entire personality. The apartment door was unlocked, and she found Daniel exactly where he'd said he'd be, on the couch watching a terrible action movie, eating birthday cake directly from the pan. He didn't pause the movie when she entered, but he didn't tell her to leave either. "Connor's finished," she said unnecessarily. "My family's finances are collapsing, and I'm apparently the stupidest brilliant woman in the country for not seeing who you were." "Not stupid," Daniel said finally, pausing the movie. "Just operating from assumptions that clouded observation. You assumed wealth looks like flash, so you missed the substance. You assumed ambition means climbing, so you missed purpose. You assumed love needs impressive gestures, so you missed devotion." Rebecca sat in the chair across from him, not the couch where she might have sat 3 years ago when they'd watched movies together, but the formal chair that acknowledged the distance now between them. "You never showed me," she said, knowing even as she spoke how inadequate the excuse sounded. "I showed you every day," Daniel corrected gently. "I just didn't show you bank statements. Every morning I made you coffee exactly how you liked it. Every night I asked about your projects with genuine interest. Every weekend I suggested activities that didn't require spending money we supposedly didn't have. The showing was constant. You were just looking at different indicators." "You let me fail every test," Rebecca said, anger finally breaking through her shock. "I let you be yourself," Daniel countered. "The tests were yours, not mine. Every time you sighed about our apartment or compared me unfavorably to colleagues with bigger salaries, that was you creating metrics I never asked you to apply. I would have been content in this apartment forever if you'd been content with me." The terrible action movie continued playing on mute, its explosions and car chases absurd background to the detonation of Rebecca's entire life. "My parents are going to lose their house," she said. "Kyle's business will fail. Connor's going to be destroyed. All because I left you on your birthday. All because they and you built security on foundations you never questioned," Daniel said. "Your parents refinanced to pay for Kyle's failed restaurant venture 5 years ago, then depended on favorable terms they didn't earn. Kyle built a business on contracts artificially inflated beyond market rates. Connor constructed an entire identity from fraud and leverage. I didn't create these vulnerabilities. I just stopped protecting people from the consequences of their own choices." "You're punishing them for my mistakes," Rebecca protested. "I'm withdrawing extraordinary support I provided for your sake," Daniel clarified. "The mortgage your parents have would be completely manageable if they'd been honest about their finances instead of pretending to a stability they didn't have. Kyle's company would survive if he'd built sustainable client relationships instead of depending on one artificially generous source. Connor's career would continue if his resume reflected actual accomplishments rather than stolen credit and fraud. Their problems are their own. They just happened while I was subsidizing solutions." Rebecca thought about her mother's dismissive comments about Daniel's threadbare jackets, her father's suggestions that she deserved a man with prospects, Kyle's pitying looks whenever Daniel drove up in his ancient sedan. They'd all created the narrative of Daniel's inadequacy because it matched their assumptions about how wealth should look, but none of them had questioned the quiet competence with which he'd actually supported their entire family structure. "What would it take," Rebecca asked carefully, "for you to reconsider the foreclosure, the contract cancellations?" "An impossible price," Daniel said immediately. "Genuine change in the people who benefited from my generosity. Evidence that they value relationships over assets. Proof that the lesson took root instead of just creating resentment about changed circumstances. Your parents would need to acknowledge that their financial peace came from my intervention, not their superior management. Kyle would need to face that his business success was artificially supported. You would need to recognize that your career advancement was partly enabled by your connection to me, even though you didn't know it." "And Connor?" Rebecca asked. "Connor goes under regardless," Daniel said without hesitation. "His situation isn't about teaching a lesson. It's about protecting the employees he victimized and the company culture he corrupted. The fraud documentation exists independent of my personal feelings. He built his own gallows through choices that hurt vulnerable people." The action movie reached its climax, the hero triumphing against impossible odds through determination and hidden resources. The parallel wasn't lost on Rebecca. She'd been so focused on obvious displays of power that she'd missed the quiet accumulation of leverage that Daniel had wielded more effectively than Connor's flash ever could. "I don't know how to fix this," Rebecca admitted. "Any of it." "You start by being honest," Daniel said, finally turning off the movie entirely. "With yourself about what actually drives you, with your family about the support system they've been taking for granted, with your career about what you've actually accomplished versus what was facilitated by connections you didn't know you had. The fixing comes after the honesty, and it's going to be uncomfortable work that takes years, not weeks." "Will you help?" Rebecca asked, knowing she had no right to the request. "I'll continue being exactly who I've always been," Daniel said, "a substitute teacher who finds fulfillment in explaining literature to middle schoolers, a property owner who believes wealth is responsibility rather than permission for excess, a person who tried to love you without requiring you to perform or impress or achieve beyond your own satisfaction. Whether that helps you depends entirely on whether you can value it this time." The following morning, Rebecca woke in the apartment's small guest room, Daniel had quietly moved her things there sometime during the night, acknowledging that their marriage bed was no longer appropriate space. The sounds of morning routine came from the kitchen, and she found Daniel making breakfast with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. But the newspaper on the counter carried headlines that marked the beginning of several endings. Sterling and Associates announces major restructuring topped the business section, and the article beneath detailed Connor Hayes's termination for fraud, expense report falsification, and violation of harassment policies. The piece was carefully worded, but Rebecca could read between the lines. Daniel's legal team had documented everything so thoroughly that Connor's career in real estate was definitively over. "He'll file bankruptcy within the month," Daniel observed, sliding a plate of eggs across to Rebecca with the same domestic care he'd shown when she thought they had no money. "The credit card debt alone will take years to resolve, and the personal guarantees he signed make discharge unlikely. He'll probably end up in actual poverty, which is ironic given how much he depended on its appearance to maintain his lifestyle." "You're satisfied with that outcome?" Rebecca asked, searching his face for triumph or vindication. "I'm satisfied that he can't hurt anyone else at my company," Daniel said. "His personal destruction is just the natural consequence of the systems he exploited catching up. I didn't create his debts. I just removed the salary that was temporarily keeping them serviceable." Rebecca's phone had been exploding since dawn with messages from her family. Her mother hysterical about the mortgage call, Kyle furious about contract cancellations, her father demanding explanations she didn't have. But there was also a message from her direct supervisor at Sterling and Associates, requesting an immediate meeting, and Rebecca's professional instincts understood that her own accounting was about to come due. "They're going to ask about Connor and me," she said, more to herself than Daniel. "HR has policies about workplace relationships." "They're going to ask about the deals you worked on while involved with Connor," Daniel corrected. "Whether your recommendations were biased by personal interests, whether the partnership track he offered was based on merit or manipulation. Your technical work was excellent, but the context in which it was produced is now suspect." The implications crashed over Rebecca like her personal employment was collateral damage in the restructuring that had eliminated Connor. "You're not protecting me from this." "I never protected you from consequences," Daniel said patiently. "I created opportunities and supported your genuine efforts, but the choice to get involved with Connor, to let personal relationships influence professional judgment, to build your advancement strategy around leveraging his position, those were your choices, and they have their own natural outcomes." Rebecca made it to Sterling and Associates by 9 a.m., her designer clothes feeling like costume rather than armor, but the person who met her wasn't HR. It was a woman Rebecca vaguely recognized from company events, though they'd never formally been introduced. The nameplate on her desk read, "Patricia Chen, Richmond Capital Trust, Executive Oversight." "Please sit, Ms. Morrison," Patricia said, her tone professionally neutral in a way that suggested everything important was happening beneath the surface. "I'm here representing the parent company to discuss your work over the past 3 years and determine appropriate next steps given yesterday's revelations." "I didn't know about Connor's fraud," Rebecca said immediately, her defense strategy activating before the questions even started. "We're aware," Patricia confirmed. "The forensic accounting shows you had no access to the expense reports or financial misrepresentations. However, your personal relationship with Mr. Hayes during active deal negotiations presents significant conflict of interest concerns, particularly on the Thornfield Properties analysis." Rebecca's brilliant mind cataloged the implications. "Every recommendation I made is now suspect because I was sleeping with the person who would benefit from successful closings." "Every recommendation you made is now subject to independent verification," Patricia corrected. "Your technical analysis was sound. I've reviewed it personally. but the appearance of impropriety requires that we reconstruct the decision-making process without your input. You're being placed on administrative leave pending ethics review." "That could take months," Rebecca protested, watching her career dissolve in real time. "Approximately 6 to 8 weeks, Patricia said, pulling up a timeline on her tablet, "during which you'll be paid full salary but required to maintain no contact with Sterling and Associates personnel or active deals. The review will determine whether your recommendations were technically sound, regardless of personal conflicts, or whether the relationship with Mr. Hayes compromised your professional objectivity." Rebecca understood the subtext. She was being evaluated for whether she'd let Connor manipulate her analysis to serve his fraudulent ambitions, even unwittingly. "And if the review finds I was compromised, then your employment is terminated with cause," Patricia said. "If the review finds your work was independent and sound despite the relationship, you'll be reinstated with mandatory ethics training and permanent flags on your file regarding workplace relationships. Either way, the partnership track Mr. Hayes promised is void, as he had no authority to offer it." The administrative leave was Daniel's mercy, Rebecca realized. He could have terminated her immediately, but instead he was providing a path to salvage her career if the work itself withstood scrutiny. It was more grace than she deserved, but less protection than she'd taken for granted, and the message was clear. She'd have to prove her value through actual merit rather than connections or relationships. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in consequences and revelation. Rebecca watched from administrative leave as Connor's life imploded spectacularly. Bankruptcy filings made public, harassment allegations from 3 junior associates, going forward with cases they'd previously been afraid to file, and eventually a fraud investigation that made regional news when prosecutors discovered the extent of his expense report falsification. Her family's situation deteriorated exactly as Daniel had outlined. Her parents couldn't make the mortgage balloon payment and faced selling their house of 3 decades. But the real estate market Daniel controlled offered only prices that barely covered the loan balance. Kyle's construction company hemorrhaged cash without his primary client, and the banks that had extended generous credit based on inflated revenue projections suddenly wanted immediate repayment. Rebecca tried to broker peace, meeting Daniel in coffee shops where they'd once had normal conversations about teaching challenges and property analysis. "My mother is having panic attacks," she said during one particularly difficult afternoon. "She's 67 years old and you're making her homeless." "I'm calling in a mortgage she couldn't actually afford," Daniel corrected, stirring his coffee with the same measured patience he brought to everything. The house they bought 30 years ago was within their means. The refinance they took out to rescue Kyle's restaurant, the one that failed because he refused to listen to basic business advice, was always going to create this pressure. "I just delayed the reckoning by 5 years." "They didn't know you were delaying anything," Rebecca protested. "They thought they'd qualified for favorable rates through normal channels." "They qualified for favorable rates because the loan officer recognized their connection to me and upgraded their terms without telling them," Daniel said. "The extraordinary support was always invisible, which allowed them to take it for granted while simultaneously dismissing me as inadequate. I'm not creating their crisis, I'm just no longer preventing it." "There has to be something I can do," Rebecca said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Some way to prove that the lesson's been learned." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Your mother called me last week," he said finally. "Demanded to know why I was punishing them for your mistakes. Suggested I was being petty and vindictive. Told me that any real man would protect his wife's family regardless of personal grievances." "She didn't know," Rebecca started, but Daniel raised a hand. "She knew exactly what she was doing," he said. leveraging the same dismissal and gender-based assumptions that allowed her to treat me like an embarrassment at family dinners. The lesson hasn't been learned, Rebecca. It's been reframed as victimization rather than accountability. Until your family can acknowledge that their stability was a gift they rejected while accepting its benefits, nothing I do will matter. The ethics review at Sterling and Associates concluded after 7 weeks with findings that vindicated Rebecca's technical work but flagged serious concerns about her professional judgment. She was reinstated but demoted from senior consultant to analyst, her salary cut by 30%, and her file permanently marked with ethics violations that would prevent any advancement for years. It was, Rebecca recognized, exactly the outcome Daniel had engineered: punishment enough to acknowledge the breach of professional conduct, but mercy enough to allow career survival if she was willing to rebuild from a humbler position. The partnership track she'd chased by leaving him had transformed into a warning label about mixing personal ambition with professional ethics. 8 months after Rebecca left Daniel on his birthday, she sat in a coffee shop across from her mother, trying to explain complexity that Patricia Morrison had no interest in understanding. The house was in final stages of foreclosure. Kyle's business had filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and the family's financial stability had collapsed into recriminations and desperate attempts to blame anyone except themselves. "You married a monster," Patricia said, stirring her coffee with the kind of aggressive motion that suggested she wanted to be stirring something harder. "A man who would destroy an entire family over hurt feelings is not someone you should have ever trusted." "He's not destroying anything," Rebecca said tiredly, having tried variations of this explanation for months. "He's just stopped subsidizing problems you all created independently. The house you refinanced beyond your means. Kyle's business built on one artificially inflated client. The lifestyle you all maintained while dismissing Daniel as worthless. That was always going to collapse without the support you never acknowledged." "We didn't ask for his support," Patricia snapped. "We didn't even know about his supposed billions. How can you hold us accountable for rejecting something we didn't know existed?" "Because you held him accountable for not providing wealth while he was actively providing it invisibly," Rebecca said, finally understanding the lesson Daniel had been teaching. "You judged him as inadequate while living in stability he created. You demanded he be someone different while benefiting from exactly who he was. The not knowing was your choice. You never asked about his actual life, his interests, his purpose. You just saw a substitute teacher's salary and assumed you knew everything about his worth." "So we're being punished for not being psychic?" Patricia demanded. "You're experiencing the natural consequences of choices made without the safety net you took for granted," Rebecca said. "If you'd built genuine financial stability, instead of leveraging refinances for Kyle's failures, the mortgage would be manageable. If you'd treated Daniel with basic respect instead of contempt, maybe his support would have continued. The punishment is just the absence of unearned protection." Patricia's face hardened in a way Rebecca recognized from her own mirror. "You're defending him after he destroyed your career and your marriage." "He didn't destroy either," Rebecca said quietly. "I destroyed my marriage by valuing status over substance. I compromised my career by letting personal relationships influence professional judgment. Daniel just stopped preventing me from experiencing the outcomes of my own choices. That's not destruction, that's accountability." The conversation ended with Patricia storming out, her anger directed at everyone except the family members who'd created their own crises. Rebecca watched her mother leave and felt something shift in her understanding. Not everyone wanted to learn the lesson. Some people would always frame accountability as persecution, consequences as cruelty, and the removal of unearned support as an attack rather than a revelation. A year after Rebecca left Daniel on his birthday, She found herself back in the modest apartment they'd shared, but this time as a guest rather than a resident. Daniel had never moved, never upgraded, never done any of the things a trillionaire supposedly does when freed from the burden of hiding his wealth. He still taught middle school literature, still drove the ancient sedan, still made homemade birthday cakes instead of buying elaborate ones. "Your mom's still angry," Daniel observed, pouring tea with the same domestic competence that had once seemed inadequate but now looked like mastery of what actually mattered. "I saw the social media posts about financial abuse and billionaire cruelty." "She'll be angry until she dies," Rebecca said honestly. "She can't accept that her financial crisis was self-created, so she's built a narrative where you're a villain who destroyed an innocent family. Kyle's doing the same. They've found therapists who will validate the victim story without asking about personal responsibility." "And you?" Daniel asked. "What narrative have you built?" Rebecca took a long breath, organizing thoughts she'd been processing through therapy of her own, the kind that asked hard questions about her values and choices rather than validating comfortable victimhood. "I built a life around assumptions I never questioned," she said. "I assumed wealth looked like flash and status, so I missed substance and purpose. I assumed love required impressive gestures, so I dismissed daily devotion. I assumed success meant climbing hierarchies, so I compromised ethics to accelerate advancement that was always illusory." "And Connor?" Daniel asked, because that wound was still relatively fresh in its devastation. "Was exactly who he appeared to be," Rebecca said. "A con artist who'd learned to perform confidence without competence. I just mistook performance for reality because I was performing the same thing, ambition without understanding what I actually wanted from life." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he'd been waiting to hear something like this. "The ethics review reinstated you," he observed. "You could rebuild your career over time." "I resigned," Rebecca said, watching his eyebrows rise slightly. "The career I was building was always about external validation rather than internal satisfaction. I was good at property analysis, but I didn't actually care about real estate beyond what status it provided. It took losing everything to realize I'd been chasing metrics I didn't value." "What do you care about?" Daniel asked, and the question carried weight because he'd spent 3 years trying to get her to answer it honestly. "I don't know yet," Rebecca admitted. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. I've been volunteering at the library where you do your weekly reading program with struggling students, helping adults study for GED exams. It's not impressive or well paid, but it's the first work I've done in years that feels like it matters beyond my resume." Daniel's smile was small but genuine. "The library program coordinator mentioned someone new who's been excellent with the ESL students. I didn't realize that was you." "I used my middle name," Rebecca said. "I needed to be somewhere that didn't carry the weight of Morrison family drama or Sterling and Associates ethics violations. Just someone helping people learn English well enough to fill out job applications. It's humbling work." "The best work usually is," Daniel said. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking tea in the modest apartment that had once seemed like a prison but now looked like a choice. Someone who could live anywhere, choosing to live simply because the location wasn't what mattered. "I should let you get back to grading papers," Rebecca said, preparing to leave. "Actually," Daniel said, pulling a folder from his desk, "there's something you should see. The ethics review at Sterling and Associates included recommendations about your future. I had final approval, and I made some decisions you should know about." Rebecca's stomach tightened, expecting another revelation of how completely Daniel controlled the architecture of her life. "What decisions?" "The demotion and salary reduction were necessary for appearances," Daniel said, "but the permanent ethics flags that would have prevented future advancement, I had those removed from your file. The official record now shows successful ethics training completion and full professional reinstatement. If you want to return to property analysis someday, the path is clear." "Why would you do that?" Rebecca asked, genuinely confused. "I betrayed you, left you on your birthday, chose Connor over you. Why clear my path forward?" "Because the punishment was never about destroying you," Daniel said simply. "It was about creating space for you to discover who you actually are without the performance pressure. You've spent a year doing humble work that nobody's impressed by, and you stuck with it. That suggests you learned something real, not just how to perform contrition." Rebecca felt tears threatening, but pushed them back because easy emotion felt like another performance. "I don't deserve your mercy." "Mercy isn't about deserving," Daniel said. "It's about recognizing when someone's actually changed versus when they're just better at hiding. You resigned from a career you'd compromised yourself to build, took work that provided no status or advancement, and stopped defending your family's victimhood narrative. Those are choices that cost you something, which makes them meaningful." "What about my parents' house?" Rebecca asked, because that wound still ached. "Kyle's bankruptcy." "Your parents sold the house and moved into a retirement community they can actually afford," Daniel said. "The sale price I allowed was sufficient to cover the mortgage, with enough left over for their transition. Kyle's business failed, but he's working construction for someone else now and learning to take direction instead of assuming he knows better than everyone. They're not comfortable, but they're solvent. That's what accountability without destruction looks like." Rebecca processed the information, recognizing the careful calibration of consequences that allowed survival without comfort, accountability without devastation. And Connor? "Connor faced legal consequences for fraud that had nothing to do with me," Daniel said. "The bankruptcy, the career destruction, the debt, those were all natural outcomes of choices he made independently. I just removed the salary that was temporarily keeping his house of cards standing. He's working retail now, paying off debt that'll take decades to resolve. That's not my doing, that's his." The mercy extended to Rebecca, but withheld from Connor illuminated the distinction Daniel was teaching. Genuine change earned grace, but performance and manipulation earned exactly what they'd built toward. Rebecca had chosen humble work and honest accounting, so the path forward remained open. Connor had built an empire on fraud and stolen credit, so the empire collapsed into the debt it was always resting on. "I'm not asking to come back," Rebecca said, needing that boundary clear. "Not to the marriage, the apartment, any of it. I just needed you to know I finally understand what you were trying to teach me." "I know," Daniel said, "and I'm not offering reconciliation. Too much broke for rebuilding, and honestly, I'm content with my life as it is. Teaching brings me joy. The volunteer reading program makes a difference. The architecture of my empire mostly runs itself through good managers. I don't need a partner who's finally learned to value what I offer. I'm complete without requiring that validation." The finality was painful, but Rebecca recognized it as appropriate. Some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired to their original state. The marriage she'd destroyed on Daniel's birthday wasn't coming back, but perhaps the person she'd been was transforming into someone who understood what she'd lost and why. "Thank you," Rebecca said, standing to leave, "for the mercy of accountability, for making the lessons hurt enough to matter, but not so much they destroyed me, for being exactly who you said you were, while I was too busy performing to notice." "Be well, Rebecca," Daniel said, walking her to the door. "And when you figure out what you actually care about, not what impresses people, but what brings you satisfaction, build something real around it. That's the actual lesson. Authenticity over performance, substance over status, purpose over position." 5 years after Rebecca Morrison left her husband on his birthday, she stood in front of a classroom that looked nothing like the corporate conference rooms where she'd once performed ambition. But the 23 adult students watching her with varying degrees of exhaustion and hope represented the most meaningful audience she'd ever addressed. The community college paid barely a third of what Sterling and Associates had, but the woman teaching English composition to working adults who'd never finished high school had finally stopped measuring success in salary brackets and portfolio values. "Remember," she said, reviewing the assignment that would determine whether several students passed the course required for their associate degrees, "the personal essay isn't about impressing me with vocabulary you don't normally use. It's about expressing something true in your authentic voice." A student named Maria raised her hand tentatively, her accent still thick despite 3 years of ESL classes. "But what if our authentic voice isn't impressive? What if our truth is just ordinary?" Rebecca paused, recognizing her younger self in the question, the assumption that ordinary meant worthless, that authenticity without performance was inadequacy rather than honesty. "The most powerful writing I've ever read," she said carefully, "came from people brave enough to be ordinary on purpose. Impressive is easy, true is hard." The class ended, but Maria lingered as students filed out, her weathered hands clutching a folder that looked like it contained something heavier than homework. "Ms. Morrison, I wanted to show you something before I submit it. My essay, it's about my husband, and I'm worried it makes me look stupid." Rebecca took the pages Maria offered, recognizing the vulnerability required to share unpolished truth with someone whose judgment mattered. The essay detailed 20 years of marriage to a man Maria had dismissed as a failure, someone who worked manual labor jobs without complaint, who never bought her fancy gifts, who seemed content with their small apartment and modest life. The turning point came when Maria discovered her husband had been sending money to support his sister's children in Honduras for 2 decades, sacrificing their own comfort to ensure his nephews and nieces could attend school. "I thought he was lazy," Maria had written in careful English that improved dramatically when emotion overrode self-consciousness. "I thought he had no ambition because he never tried to get promoted or make more money. But he was choosing family over career, love over status, doing hard things quietly instead of easy things loudly. I almost left him before I learned to see." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she read words that mirrored her own journey with painful precision, but from a woman who'd learned the lesson without destroying what she'd undervalued. "This is exceptional, Maria," she said quietly, "not because the writing is polished, though it gets better as you go when you stop trying to impress and start trying to communicate. It's exceptional because you're documenting a transformation most people never experience." "You think I should submit it?" Maria asked anxiously, "even though it makes me look bad?" "Especially because it makes you look bad," Rebecca said. "Growth requires acknowledging who we were before we knew better. The readers who matter will recognize courage in that honesty." Maria left clutching her essay like a talisman, but her story lingered in Rebecca's mind as she gathered her teaching materials and prepared for the evening's second job, grant writing for the literacy nonprofit where she'd started as a volunteer 4 years ago. The work was unglamorous and poorly compensated, but it funded programs that changed lives in measurable ways, and Rebecca had finally learned to value impact over impression. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, the first communication in 6 months, after Patricia Morrison had finally exhausted her anger enough to attempt reconciliation. "Your father fell. Hospital says he'll be okay, but we're worried about the bills. Can we talk?" Rebecca stared at the message, recognizing the familiar pattern of her family reaching out only when crisis required resources they didn't have. 5 years ago, she would have panicked and tried to fix it, or would have called Daniel begging for mercy she didn't deserve. But 5 years of actual growth had taught her boundaries that protected everyone involved. She called instead of texting, her voice gentle but firm when Patricia answered with the frantic energy of someone who'd been catastrophizing for hours. "Mom, I'm glad you told me about Dad. I'll visit this weekend. but I can't solve your financial situation, and you need to stop expecting rescue from crises you can manage yourselves. We don't have savings, Patricia said, the statement carrying accusation like Rebecca should have prevented this somehow. The retirement community takes most of our income, and now these medical bills. Dad has Medicare, Rebecca interrupted, having learned enough about elder care through her non-profit work to recognize manufactured crisis from genuine emergency. The hospital has financial assistance programs. You have options that don't require me to deplete resources I don't have while you continue spending on things you want rather than need. The conversation ended badly, as it usually did when Rebecca refused to enable the victim narrative her parents had constructed, but she'd stopped taking responsibility for their refusal to accept accountability. Her father would recover, the bills would get negotiated down or covered by programs Patricia was too proud to apply for, and the pattern would repeat until her parents finally learned to live within their actual means, rather than the inflated lifestyle Daniel's invisible support had once subsidized. Kyle had learned that lesson faster, though it had taken bankruptcy and 2 years of working construction for someone else's company to break through his defensive arrogance. He'd called Rebecca 3 months ago from a job site, his voice carrying exhaustion, but also something that sounded like peace. "I'm building someone else's vision," he'd said. "And it turns out I'm actually good at construction when I'm not trying to pretend I'm a business genius. Dad thinks I've failed because I'm not the boss anymore, but I'm making decent money, learning real skills, and sleeping at night without worrying about payroll. Feels more like success than the company I lost ever did." The difference between Kyle's growth and their parents' stagnation illustrated what Rebecca had finally understood about Daniel's calibrated consequences. Some people learned from accountability, while others just refined their resentment. The ones who learned found surprising peace in living within their actual capabilities. The ones who resented spent years constructing narratives about victimhood that prevented any genuine growth. Rebecca drove from the community college to the literacy nonprofit's cramped office in a building that smelled like old carpets and possibility, but the modest space held more satisfaction than Sterling and Associates' glass tower ever had. The executive director, a former teacher named James who'd built the organization from nothing over 15 years, was reviewing grant applications when Rebecca arrived. "The Morrison magic," he said, gesturing to her laptop as she sat up at the communal work table. 3 grant applications due Friday, and you're the only reason we'll make the deadlines. "Grant writing isn't magic," Rebecca said, opening files that represented hundreds of hours of work she'd taught herself through online courses and painful trial and error. "It's just translating impact into language that funding committees value. Same skill set as property analysis, actually. Understanding what decision makers need to hear to feel confident about investment." "Speaking of investments," James said carefully, "the board meeting last week discussed creating a development director position, paid salary instead of hourly grant writing. You'd be the obvious choice, but I wanted to check your interest before we formalize anything." Rebecca felt the familiar pull of advancement opportunity, but this time she paused to examine what accepting would actually mean, rather than reflexively climbing because the ladder existed. "What would I stop doing if I became development director?" she asked. "The classroom teaching, probably," James admitted. "The position would be full-time fundraising, grant writing, donor cultivation, corporate partnerships. Important work, but different work." "Then I'm not interested," Rebecca said, surprising herself with the clarity of her decision. "The teaching is what matters to me. The grant writing funds it, but I'm not ready to give up classroom time for networking with wealthy donors and writing proposals that might fund programs I'm not directly involved in anymore." James nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. "That's a remarkably mature answer. Most people grab every advancement opportunity, without questioning whether it moves them toward what they actually want. Most people are performing success rather than pursuing satisfaction, Rebecca said, the words carrying 5 years of expensive lessons. I spent my 20s and early 30s optimizing for impressive. I'm trying to optimize for meaningful now, even when meaningful looks ordinary from the outside. The grant applications took until midnight, but Rebecca worked with focus that came from genuine investment in outcomes rather than external validation. The proposals would fund literacy programs for immigrants, job training for formerly incarcerated adults, and summer reading initiatives in underserved neighborhoods, work that wouldn't make headlines but would change specific lives in documentable ways. She was closing her laptop when her phone displayed a notification that made her pause. Daniel Richmond Morrison tagged in article, Anonymous Donors Reshape Educational Landscape. Rebecca hesitated before clicking, knowing that following Daniel's life through media coverage was probably unhealthy, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. The article detailed how several major educational initiatives across the country had received sudden, massive funding from anonymous sources: scholarships for substitute teachers pursuing permanent certification, grants for schools in economically struggling areas, endowments for literacy programs that matched exactly the work Rebecca was doing. The donations totaled over $40 million, but the article noted frustration among journalists trying to identify the benefactor. Sources close to the funding mechanism describe the donor as someone with deep pockets and deeper privacy concerns, the piece read. When pressed for comment, a spokesperson for Richmond Capital Trust would only say, "Our client believes education shapes society more effectively than wealth accumulation, and prefers supporting teachers to collecting recognition." Rebecca recognized Daniel's philosophy in every word, but more than that, she recognized his pattern, using wealth to amplify work that mattered while remaining invisible himself. The substitute teacher who owned $47 billion in assets was funding other substitute teachers, supporting literacy programs like the one Rebecca worked for, creating infrastructure that would outlast any individual contribution. She drafted a text 3 times before deleting it. Saw the article. The work you're funding is beautiful. But sending it felt like reaching for connection. She'd forfeited the right to expect, so instead, she just made a note in her grant files. Research Richmond Capital Trust, educational initiatives, possible alignment with our mission for future funding. Professional interest was appropriate, personal commentary was not. The weekend visit to her father in the hospital was predictably uncomfortable, with Patricia alternating between genuine concern for her husband and pointed comments about Rebecca's disappointing life choices. The fact that Rebecca taught community college instead of consulting on multi-million-dollar deals apparently reflected poorly on the family's status. Never mind that Rebecca had finally found work that didn't make her soul feel like a performance space. "Connor Hayes works at a Target now," Patricia said, while Rebecca's father slept, her tone suggesting this was somehow Rebecca's tragedy rather than Connor's natural consequence. "I saw him last month in the electronics department. He looked so defeated. You could have had everything with him, and instead, you're teaching immigrants to write essays nobody will read. Connor's working retail because he committed fraud and harassment that cost him his career," Rebecca said evenly, refusing to accept her mother's framing. "I'm teaching immigrants to write essays that help them pass courses that lead to degrees that change their lives. Those outcomes aren't equivalent, and your inability to see the difference is why you're constantly anxious about status. I stopped caring about years ago." "You stopped caring because you failed," Patricia snapped, her anxiety seeking targets. "You had a real career, a successful boyfriend, a future that looked impressive. Then you threw it away for what? Hourly wages and adult students who will never be grateful." "For authenticity," Rebecca said simply. "For work that matters more than how it looks." For students who show up exhausted from double shifts, but still try to master semicolons because education represents hope in ways you've never had to understand. You're right that it's not impressive. But impressive was making me miserable, and ordinary makes me satisfied. Patricia's expression suggested she'd continue arguing, but Rebecca's father woke and the conversation shifted to practical matters about insurance and recovery timelines. The visit ended with tentative plans for Rebecca to return the following weekend, but without the financial rescue her parents clearly expected, the relationship remained strained by their insistence that she should be someone she'd finally stopped trying to become. Kyle called as Rebecca drove home, his voice carrying news he'd clearly been waiting to share. "I'm getting married," he said, excitement cutting through his usual defensive sarcasm. "Her name's Jennifer. She works at the same construction company, and she knows exactly who I am, including the bankruptcy, the failed business, all of it. She likes me anyway." "That's wonderful, Kyle," Rebecca said, genuine warmth flooding her response. "When did this happen?" "She proposed to me last weekend," Kyle said with a laugh that sounded like freedom. "Said she was tired of waiting for me to get my confidence back enough to ask her. Turns out being honest about my failures and limitations, instead of pretending I'm more than I am, is actually attractive to people who value honesty." The parallel to Daniel wasn't lost on Rebecca. Both men had been loved by women who saw them clearly rather than requiring them to perform success they hadn't achieved. But where Daniel had tested Rebecca by hiding his wealth, Jennifer had simply accepted Kyle at his actual level and decided that was enough. "I'm happy for you," Rebecca said. "Genuinely, that kind of acceptance is rare." "You taught me that," Kyle said quietly. "Not on purpose, probably, but watching you actually change instead of just performing. Growth showed me what transformation looks like. I spent 3 years blaming everyone else for my business failing. Blamed you, blamed Daniel, blamed the economy. Then I watched you go from six-figure consultant to minimum wage volunteer without making excuses, and it made me look at my own bullshit differently." "I made plenty of excuses," Rebecca said honestly. "It took a long time to move past victimhood into accountability." "But you did move past it," Kyle insisted. "Mom and Dad never will. They'll die angry, convinced the world wronged them. But you changed, and that gave me permission to change too. So thank you. And hey, you're invited to the wedding. Small ceremony, no expensive venue, just people who actually care about us rather than performing for an audience." The invitation represented more than logistics. It was Kyle acknowledging that she'd become someone he trusted to witness his joy without judgment, someone who'd value the authenticity of his modest wedding more than the status its simplicity represented. 3 years later, Rebecca sat in the audience at Maria's college graduation, watching her former student walk across the stage to receive an associate degree that represented 5 years of night classes and weekend study while working full-time as a home health aide. Maria's husband sat beside Rebecca, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched his wife achieve something his financial sacrifices had finally made possible. "She almost left me," he said quietly to Rebecca during the ceremony. 8 years ago, said I had no ambition, that she deserved better. Then she found the Western Union receipts I'd been hiding, the money I sent home to Honduras. She was so angry at first, thought I'd been lying about what we could afford. But then she met my sister on video call, saw the school uniforms my money bought, heard my nephews reading in English and Spanish. She said it changed how she saw everything. She wrote about it, Rebecca said, in an essay for my class. It was beautiful. Honest about her mistakes without being self-pitying. She called it learning to see what was always there. "That's what Daniel said to you, wasn't it?" Maria's husband asked, revealing that Maria had shared more of her teacher's story than Rebecca realized. That you couldn't see what he was because you were looking at the wrong things? Something like that, Rebecca confirmed, watching Maria accept her diploma with a joy that had nothing to do with impressing anyone and everything to do with personal achievement that had cost real sacrifice. Though in my case, what I couldn't see was worth $47 billion. But you see it now? He pressed. I see what matters now, Rebecca corrected, which isn't quite the same thing. I'll never know if I could have loved Daniel for who he was without the wealth, because I failed that test spectacularly, but I've learned to love work that matters more than work that impresses, and that's its own kind of vision correction. The graduation ended with celebrations in the parking lot, families gathering around folding tables with homemade food and genuine joy that had nothing to do with venue prestige or expensive catering. Maria introduced Rebecca to relatives who'd driven from 3 states away, describing her teacher with reverence that made Rebecca uncomfortable because she'd just been doing her job, which was exactly the point. Work done well didn't need to be impressive to matter. Rebecca's phone buzzed with an email that made her smile despite herself. Grant application status update, approved. The Richmond Capital Trust Educational Initiative had funded her nonprofit's entire operating budget for the next 3 years, with specific earmarks for the adult literacy program she'd built from nothing. The approval came with a note from the program officer. Our benefactor rarely provides feedback on grant applications, but wanted you to know this work exemplifies the kind of grassroots educational impact we're trying to amplify. Well done. The benefactor was Daniel, obviously, but the acknowledgement came through professional channels without requiring personal gratitude or reopening wounds neither of them needed to revisit. He was funding her work because it was valuable, not because she was his ex-wife. The distinction mattered more than Rebecca could articulate. 5 years after standing in Maria's graduation audience, Rebecca published her first book. Not the impressive business memoir she might have written in her Sterling and Associates days, but a practical guide for community college instructors teaching adult students who were juggling work, family, and education. The book sold modestly, but its reviews came from teachers who implemented her strategies and saw improved retention rates, and that impact mattered more than bestseller status ever could. The book tour was equally modest, community colleges and literacy conferences rather than major bookstores. But at a presentation in Portland, a man in the back row asked a question that stopped Rebecca's breath. How do you help students value authentic growth over performed success when our entire culture rewards the opposite? She recognized Daniel's voice before she registered his presence, though 10 years had added distinguished gray to his hair and deeper lines around his eyes. He still wore clothes that looked comfortable rather than expensive, still carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need external validation. You model it, Rebecca answered carefully, speaking to the whole room but watching Daniel. You show them teachers who choose meaning over money, authors who write books that help rather than impress, professionals who measure success in impact rather than income. And you hope some students recognize that path as available rather than assuming prestigious is the only option. The presentation ended with polite applause, but Daniel waited until the room emptied before approaching the signing table where Rebecca was packing unsold books. The guide is excellent, he said without preamble. I've bought copies for every teacher in my school and recommended it to the Richmond Capital Trust Educational Board for wider distribution. Thank you, Rebecca said, her voice steadier than her hands. That means a lot. How's 8th grade literature treating you? Same as always, Daniel said with a slight smile. I'm currently explaining To Kill a Mockingbird to students who think it's boring until they realize it's about seeing people as they are rather than as they appear. Some lessons stay relevant regardless of era. The parallel to their own story hung unspoken between them, but Rebecca didn't have energy for subtext. "Did you come just to compliment my book, or is there something else?" "Your mother died last month," Daniel said gently. "I saw the obituary. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry, even though I know your relationship was complicated." Rebecca absorbed the information with complicated grief. Patricia Morrison had never stopped being angry about the foreclosure, never accepted that her financial crisis was self-created, and had died still convinced she'd been victimized rather than held accountable. The funeral had been small and tense, with Rebecca and Kyle paying for arrangements their father couldn't afford, while he complained that Daniel's cruelty had killed his wife through stress. "She was angry until the end," Rebecca said. "Blamed you for everything, the house, the money troubles, even Dad's health problems. She never learned the lesson you were teaching." "Not everyone can," Daniel said simply. "Some people are too invested in their victim narrative to accept accountability. That was never your mother's fault exactly. She learned to survive through blame during a childhood you don't know much about. But it did mean she couldn't grow past certain limitations." "You knew about her childhood?" Rebecca asked, surprised. "I know about everyone who matters to people I care about," Daniel said. "Your mother's father was an alcoholic who blamed everyone around him for his failures. She learned that pattern early and never questioned whether it was healthy. I had sympathy for her even while holding boundaries she couldn't respect." The casual mention of people I care about, in present tense, made Rebecca's chest tighten, but she didn't let herself read meaning into word choice. "Dad's in assisted living now," she said. "Kyle and I split the costs. It's not luxurious, but he's safe and cared for. He still thinks you destroyed the family fortune we never actually had." "And you?" Daniel asked. "What do you think 10 years later?" Rebecca considered the question with the depth it deserved, measuring her answer against the person she'd become rather than who she'd been. "I think you did something impossibly difficult," she said finally. "You loved someone enough to let them fail completely, so they might learn to succeed authentically. Most people can't maintain that boundary. They either enable forever or cut off completely. You found the exact middle point where consequences taught without destroying, where accountability created opportunity for growth." "Not everyone grew," Daniel observed. "No," Rebecca agreed. "Mom didn't, Dad won't. Connor certainly didn't. I saw an article about him last year, still blaming everyone else for choices that were always his. But Kyle grew. I grew. Maria and dozens of other students grew by watching me grow. The lesson multiplied beyond just the people you were trying to teach." "That was always the hope," Daniel said, "though I'll admit the personal cost was higher than I anticipated. Loving you was easy. Watching you leave was necessary but not painless. Holding boundaries while you learned was the hardest thing I've done. And I've negotiated with dictators over property rights." The admission cracked something in Rebecca's careful composure, but she held herself together because this conversation wasn't about reconciliation. It was about closure, acknowledgement, the recognition of transformation that had cost them both something irreplaceable. "I'm seeing someone," Rebecca said, needing that fact established before either of them confused nostalgia for possibility. "His name is Marcus. He teaches physics at the community college, and he drives a worse car than you do. We're happy in ways that don't photograph well, and I finally understand why that matters more than impressive." "I'm glad," Daniel said, and his smile reached his eyes. "Truly, you deserve to find someone who values you for the work you do rather than the status you project." "What about you?" Rebecca asked. Is there anyone?" "A few someones over the years," Daniel said. "Nothing that felt permanent enough to formalize. Turns out being a substitute teacher billionaire creates complicated dating dynamics. Either they want the money and tolerate the teaching, or they want the modest lifestyle and resent the wealth. Finding someone who values both for different reasons is rare. You're looking for someone like you were, Rebecca said, understanding dawning. Someone content with enough, who sees wealth as responsibility rather than permission for excess. Someone authentic, Daniel corrected. Whether that looks like modest substitute teacher or ambitious consultant doesn't matter as much as whether they're being true to what they actually value. You weren't authentic when we married. You were performing someone you thought you should be. That wasn't sustainable for either of us. The truth of it settled like sediment after years of churning water. They'd both been performing in different ways. Daniel hiding his wealth to test for authentic connection. Rebecca pretending contentment while hungering for more. The collision had been inevitable once their performances couldn't maintain themselves against reality. "Thank you," Rebecca said finally, "for coming to tell me about Mom, and for funding my work without making it weird, and for being exactly who you said you were even when it cost you things you loved." "Be well, Rebecca," Daniel said, echoing his goodbye from 10 years earlier. "Keep teaching people to value authentic over impressive. The world needs more of that, and you're good at modeling what transformation actually looks like." He left the same way he'd always moved through the world, quietly without fanfare, someone whose presence mattered more than his visibility. Rebecca watched him go and felt grateful for the first time that their love story had ended when it did, because the people they'd needed to become required destruction of the performances they'd been maintaining. 15 years after Rebecca left Daniel on his birthday, she sat in her modest living room with Marcus, grading essays from students who were learning to express themselves authentically rather than impressively. The work was endless and undercompensated, but it mattered in ways her 6-figure salary never had, and that difference was everything. "One of your students submitted an essay about her ex-husband," Marcus said, reading over her shoulder with the casual intimacy of 8 years together. "Says he was a trillionaire who pretended to be poor, and she left him for his boss without realizing who she was actually married to." "This is fiction, right? Creative non-fiction assignment?" Rebecca took the pages Marcus offered, recognizing immediately that the student was writing about Rebecca's own story. Maria must have shared the tale with others who'd found it resonant enough to explore in their own writing. "It's based on a true story," Rebecca said. "My story, actually, though I see she's added elements that make it more dramatic than the reality." "Wait, seriously?" Marcus's eyes widened. "You were married to a trillionaire substitute teacher. That's the ex you never want to talk about." "That's him," Rebecca confirmed. "I spent 3 years dismissing him as inadequate, left him on his birthday for my boss who turned out to be a fraud, and discovered too late that the poor husband I'd abandoned owned the empire I'd been working to impress. He let me fail completely so I might learn what authentic success actually meant. It took years to understand he was showing mercy, not cruelty." Marcus processed this information with the careful thought he brought to physics problems, examining variables before reaching conclusions. "And you learned—" "What, exactly? That you should have stayed with the billionaire. That I should have valued substance over status," Rebecca corrected. "Whether that meant staying with Daniel or not is almost beside the point. The lesson was about authentic appreciation for what matters versus performed ambition for what impresses. I failed spectacularly at the former while succeeding impressively at the latter until the performance collapsed and forced me to examine what I actually valued." "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked quietly. "Losing access to that wealth, that security." Rebecca looked around their small living room, comfortable but not luxurious, filled with books and student work rather than expensive art. She thought about her community college salary that required budgeting, her 10-year-old car that needed repairs she and Marcus saved for carefully, their modest life that looked ordinary from every angle except satisfaction. "I regret hurting someone who loved me authentically," she said honestly. I regret wasting 3 years performing instead of being present. I regret the arrogance that made me think substitute teacher was a limitation rather than a choice. But do I regret ending up here doing this work with you? Not even slightly. This life is ordinary and unimpressive and more satisfying than the empire I was chasing would ever have been. Even knowing you could have had 47 billion reasons to feel differently, Marcus pressed. Especially knowing that, Rebecca said, because I learned the hard way that wealth without wisdom is just expensive emptiness. Status without substance is just performing for strangers, and impressive without authentic is just exhausting. I'd rather be ordinary and real than impressive and hollow. That lesson cost me everything I thought I wanted and gave me everything I didn't know I needed. Marcus kissed her gently, his affection uncomplicated by ulterior motives or performance pressure, and Rebecca felt grateful for the journey that had led her here. The trillionaire husband she'd abandoned had taught her the most expensive lesson of her life, that some things matter more than money. Some people are worth more than their bank statements, and authentic ordinary is infinitely more valuable than impressive hollow. Somewhere across the country, Daniel Richmond Morrison was probably grading papers in a modest apartment, content in the life he'd chosen, secure in the empire he operated invisibly, satisfied with work that mattered more than status. He'd loved her enough to let her fail completely, held boundaries that created space for transformation, and funded her life's work without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement. The story that began with a woman leaving her poor husband on his birthday to marry his arrogant boss had ended with that woman learning that wealth shows itself in character rather than bank statements. Success measures impact rather than income, and love sometimes means creating consequences that hurt enough to teach without destroying completely. Rebecca Morrison had learned to see what Daniel had been showing her all along, that authentic beats impressive every single time, that substance matters more than status, and that the quiet man grading middle school essays was richer in every way that mattered than the flashy boss, whose empire was built on leverage and lies. The Hook had promised viral drama about unaware wives and hidden trillionaires, but the story delivered something more enduring, a testament to the long, difficult journey from performance to authenticity, from impressive to meaningful, from status to substance. And that transformation, Rebecca finally understood, was worth more than any empire, even one worth $47 billion.